Reading first from Genesis chapter 37, starting at the 12th verse, and that's found at page 60 in your pulpit Bible, or your pew Bible. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I am looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance. And before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." And when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe that he was wearing. And they took him and threw him into the cistern. And the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. And we continue further in Genesis 39, verses 1 to 20, found in 64 of your Bibles. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And the Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And when the master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all of that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or to even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. And when she saw that she had his cloak in her hand and run him out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came here to sleep with me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. And then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, in the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And we continue in Genesis chapter 41 on page 66. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. And then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but none of them could interpret them for him. And then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants. He imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And when he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to him, "Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This is the word of the Lord. Well, that was a lot to read, and perhaps most of us know the story of Joseph, and there's a lot more in that we could have looked at. But we know this. You know, Dolly Parton sang a song about his coat of many colors. There was that Broadway play about the Technicolor Dreamcoat. We've heard about this story, if not in Sunday school or worship, through the public media and plays and songs. And it was that colored coat, a sign that his father loved him best, that would lead to the hatred that his brothers felt toward him. And additionally, it was his dreams about his brothers bowing down to him that sealed his fate. He lorded over them, and they were done with him. They wanted to kill him. Fortunately, the oldest brother diverted that plan and had him thrown into a cistern, and he was going to let him out later. But in the meantime, the other brothers sold him to a Midianite caravan. So as we trace this story of Joseph, we will see that God has always been present with him and preparing Joseph to be the answer for providing for his family. And in this series on waiting, we are reminded that that plan would not be revealed for decades. That revelation that God is in this begins as we see Joseph in the cistern, waiting and wondering what will happen to him. Maybe a little afraid, maybe, hopefully, a little humbled. There's a rabbinical midrash which points to the unfolding of God and all that there is to come. And the scriptures that we read today simply said the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. But the midrash says the cistern was empty except for a scorpion and a snake. Interesting, isn't it? There's a real sign that there is danger for Joseph. This could be a life-ending situation, even without being murdered. But we are meant to look beyond the danger and to see that if there's already a scorpion and a snake in the cistern before Joseph is lowered into it, then God's creation was already present. And where God's creation is present, God is present. And where God is present, God's grace and salvation is present. Was Joseph aware that God was present? That grace and salvation were present? Did he stay aware of that on the journey into Egypt or when he was sold into slavery? Waiting on God, even when there are signs that God is present, can be frustrating and confusing. And more than that, it can lead to despair as we wonder why God isn't answering prayer and why God isn't already working to make things better. I think that in this story, we are reminded that God is in the waiting. God has already prepared for everything and is in this waiting time. We need to remember that regardless of our circumstances, God is present and working on our behalf. Our waiting must ultimately be about our trusting. But how do we do that? We watch for signs of God. There were signs that Joseph was in God's favor. Potiphar purchased him as a slave, and in time noticed that Joseph was a diligent and hard worker, and he was promoted to be the manager of all of his household. However, if Joseph thought this was a part of the way in which God would release him to go home, he was mistaken. Unfortunately, Potiphar wasn't the only one who noticed Joseph. Potiphar's wife was very taken by this good-looking, strong young man and kept making sexual overtures to him. He always replied that he had no intention of abusing the trust of his master or of offending his God. And Potiphar's wife plotted to have Joseph be alone with her in the house, and then she attacked him and tore off his robe. He ran away. And she used that robe as evidence that Joseph had attacked her, and Potiphar heard about it, and he had Joseph thrown into jail. And yet God was still with him. Which leads us to the second lesson that Joseph needed to learn in the wait: humility. He was a brash, young, good-looking man who had lorded it over his brothers and been spoiled by his father. And even as a slave, he had risen quickly to a place of honor in the household. And as he waited in prison, he learned the lessons of life in a very difficult way. And that's not to say that this was punishment. This was for Joseph another part of the time of preparation. We're reminded that waiting on God is about trust. Waiting is about being humble. It's about a time in which we will grow and change, learning the lessons that God is giving to us. Waiting is about preparation. And when we wait on God and His timing, He prepares us for what is to come. Root and Bertrand write that all that we really have is this moment that we are in and the people that we are with right now. Right now. And these people are our moment. God's plan can't work if we want everything to be in our control. Even Jesus gave over everything that was rightly His to humbly and obediently go where God asked. Did we ever pause to think, though, that for Jesus, humility was power? And what about for us? It bears thinking about. After all, in our prevailing culture, the message is that submitting, surrendering, and humility are to be avoided. Instead, we're told to claim our power, stand our ground, set our boundaries. Good advice in some circumstances, but not in our relationship with God. And our culture also tells us that submitting to God is not a good thing. After all, we should not be giving up control of our lives, especially not to a capricious God. And yet today, we are asked to consider that submitting to God is where our power comes from. Surrendering our will to God gives us power. Being humble before God gives us power. Waiting with peace and calm and trust is our source of power. Last week we explored the concept that waiting is not passiveness, but rather a choice. The same holds true for submitting and surrendering and humbling ourselves. It's a choice. It's a choice in which we trust God and expect that in His time He will give us the guidance and direction that we need. It is powerful to trust. In contrast to weakness, which leads to doubt and questioning, and weakness leads to wondering if God heard us, and us pestering Him constantly to remind Him about our prayers. And in that weakness, we tell God what we want done. None of that comes from a place of strength, but from a place of fear. Surrender, submission, and humility are the hallmarks of strength and trust. So what of Joseph? Well, when we left him, he had just been sent to prison. He was an innocent man in prison for doing something that he did not do. Do we recall that God was with Joseph in the cistern and in slavery? Well, God continues to be with Joseph in prison. And those very dreams that caused his brothers to hate him became a part of the God being with him. And in Exodus we read that while Joseph was in prison, the Lord was with him and showed him kindness and granted him favor. And the warden put Joseph in charge of all things within the prison and was made responsible for everything that was going on there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because God was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. That fear response would have been to go there and fight for his rights, demand to see the warden, plead his case. The giving up response would have been to retreat to a corner and complain to anyone that would listen about what had happened to him. But rather he submitted and surrendered to his new situation and was humbled by the trust given to him by the prison warden. And God then was able to use the gifts that he had given Joseph. We remember that way back as a boy he had dreams from God that spoke of some provision that would happen for the future. We remember how in pride and arrogance he used those dreams to show how he was better than his brothers. Through his experiences, he has learned that his gifts are not about him, but about God. His gift of understanding God's message in dreams now humbles him. And he realizes that it is for the benefit of others in the prison. It's no longer all about Joseph, but about what God can do through Joseph. And all this growth and spiritual awareness came in the waiting. That was not a confirmation of what God was calling forth ultimately in Joseph. That was not about how Joseph would save his family. All of that was still waiting to be revealed. In prison, Joseph learned to use his God-given gifts with humility. There, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker brought their dreams before Joseph. The cupbearer spoke of a dream in which he pressed the grapes by hand into Pharaoh's cup. And the baker dreamt of having baskets of bread on his head, but the birds kept eating the bread. And the cupbearer was told that he would return to his job as the winemaker for Pharaoh. And the baker was informed that he would lose his head and his body put out on a spit for birds to eat. Then Joseph extracted a promise from the cupbearer to tell his story to Pharaoh, and the cupbearer went on his way. And once out of prison, he promptly kept his promise. Or rather, 2 years later, he remembered his promise. That left Joseph waiting in prison for 2 more years. 2 more years. What would be the temptation to believe that God had abandoned him? Did this put a strain on Joseph's newfound state of trust, in submission and surrender and humility? Did he have weak moments and complain to God that he was being neglected and ignored? Did he demand his freedom immediately? We see none of that in Scripture. Joseph waited 2 more years. When we wait, it's about more than waiting for God to speak to us about what we're supposed to do. It's about waiting for God to act and for the Holy Spirit to move until the time is right for God to connect to us. Even if we're doing God's will, it doesn't work if God hasn't prepared the ground ahead of time. Up until the time is right for God to connect to us and put his plan into motion. And we recall that God was planning a future for Joseph from the time that Joseph was a boy. The waiting was about the unfolding of God's timing. In that waiting, we learn to listen not only to God, but to also those whom God sends to us. There are many roads in our growth. And when we are surrendered, we trust that in those moments we will encounter a resonance that will connect us deeply with the world and with God who loves the world and with all of the people who join us in this portion of God's world. We wait with anticipation and submission for God's action. So 2 years later, Pharaoh's having disturbing dreams, and the cupbearer belatedly remembers his promise to Joseph. Pharaoh has Joseph released from prison, and Joseph is brought forth to hear Pharaoh's dreams. 7 fat cows, followed by 7 emaciated cows who ate the fat cows. And then 7 healthy heads of grain, followed by 7 scorched heads of grain that ate the healthy grain. And when asked to interpret the dreams, Joseph's response was, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Clearly, he has remembered the lesson of humility, and he has learned the lesson that he is not the center of the universe. This is not all about Joseph, but instead all about God's grace. Joseph has come a long way. This humility and trust in God are going to be a very important thing for Joseph going forward, because now he begins the wait for what God has been intending to call forth from Joseph from the very beginning. He becomes the chief in Pharaoh's household, governor of the land, and he marries and has children whom he names after his brothers. And then 7 years later, as the famine ravages Egypt and Joseph's homeland, he becomes the one who will save his family from drought and famine. His brothers will come and bow down before him just like he saw in his dreams. But now, instead of it being a source of arrogance, it will break his heart. He cries even as he manipulates his brothers until they leave and come back with all the other brothers, and eventually with his father and the whole household. And he cries again when he sees his brother Benjamin, and he cries again when he tells them all about who he is, and he absolves them of the guilt of selling him into slavery, because he knows this was all God's plan. In all the trips back and forth, and until his family were all finally safely gathered together, I can imagine that the anticipation must have made that the most difficult times in which he waited. Now he waits to have his heart healed and to see his whole family healed and everyone safely together. And he recognizes that this calling is not about him, but about God's grace. Root and Bertrand write that sometimes the waiting can feel like painful standing still. Sometimes that waiting can be heartbreaking. About the waiting is what causes us to grow in humility and give everything to God to work out to his good will, surrender, submission, humility, trust, hope, resonance with others, and more importantly, surrender to God are the factors that shape us into the people that God can use. We see all of that in Joseph. In every situation in which he waited, he developed resonance in the relationships with those with whom he was working and living. When his brothers came to Egypt, he forgives them and develops a resonance with them as they learn to trust him and believe that he's not out seeking revenge. Sometimes it can take decades until that growth in humility is complete in us. We, who are the church, are also called to wait and learn how to trust God in the storm, the good times, and the long, lonely days. We are reminded that our story is not about us, but about the unfolding of God's grace among us. We are reminded that the gifts we have for ministry are not about what we can do, but instead about what God will do through us at the right time, in the right place, if we will just surrender. We're reminded that we must grow into humility if we are ever to be useful to God. That painful standing still that Ruth and Bertrand speak of is the place where we need to choose to give our will over to God and wait for the Spirit to speak within us, no matter how long it takes, be that days or weeks or decades. And until we learn those lessons, we will be prisoners, as surely as Joseph was a prisoner. Learning how to be God's prisoner is the road to humility and the surrender that allows God to reveal his will for us in his timing. It may not sound like it, but this is good news. Wait and surrender. Wait and be humble. Wait and submit. Wait, and in time God will reveal everything. Yes, this is good news. Amen.